Okay, we can probably get started. For those who don't know me, I'm Jennifer Donahue. I'm the communications manager for the Washington chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And we have some experts here with us today to do a quick media training. We've got Lisa Black and Susan Martin from the AAP, and then our own immediate past president, Elizabeth Mead, who's going to share some of her experience as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan and Lisa.
Everybody, thank you so much for taking a little bit of time today to talk with us and improve your skills on working with the media. As you've all seen, this is a critically important way that we communicate with the public. It helps us inform parents about how to take care of their children. It helps set the agenda, and it's really a very effective way to advocate for children in the US and around the globe. So I appreciate you taking a little bit of time today to talk about improving your skills. We'll talk a little bit about how to prepare for an interview, how to vet an interview to decide whether it's the right way to communicate a message. And then we'll review some of the specific skills that are good to have during the interview to help you get that message across. Next slide, please. All right, so first of all, when you're doing a media interview, it's good to be very clear about who you're representing. Many of you probably have multiple roles. You may be in an institution such as a hospital or clinic. You may be a national spokesperson for AAP or for your chapter. It's good to make that very clear with the reporter when you are starting that interview so that you'll be identified appropriately. And we always like to remind folks to make sure you understand the rules of your own institution in terms of doing media interviews. Next slide. Okay, so when you're approached by the media, often it is the best way for you to get your message out, but it helps to do a little analysis before accepting an interview request that will help you approach that interview appropriately and understand if it's really going to be the best platform for your message. Does the outlet reach your intended audience? Often state and local media can be extremely influential, especially with policymakers in your state. So that could be a really critical way for you to reach those decision makers. A national audience, a national platform can help you set a national agenda for a broader conversation. Sometimes very niche outlets can be extremely influential as well. So don't turn down a request from a smaller outlet if it reaches an audience that is really important for your communications goal. How is the outlet approaching the question? This is really important. If you're invited to give an interview on COVID vaccine, you want to know, are they writing a very straightforward piece about the research and the recommendations for children? Or are they profiling a family who believes their child suffered myocarditis after the vaccine? You might decide to do both interviews, but how you prepare may be different. So that's really important to understand. You want to know the outlet and reporter, what is their point of view? A lot of, for example, some of the cable news shows, those are more commentators rather than straightforward journalists. If they're carrying a very specific point of view, that's really important to understand before you go into that interview. Who else is being interviewed? A panel presentation is one thing, but we are cautious about engaging in pieces that are pro-con pieces about vaccines or other issues, especially if they will elevate someone who is not a physician or not an expert and put them on the same level as a credible expert. And then finally, spokesperson. Are you the right person to do this interview? Often the answer is yes, but just be clear about who you're able to represent, what your expertise is. Do you have the perspective that is needed for that piece? Sometimes the answer is no, that's okay. If you don't have time to do the interview because of other obligations, that's also okay. AAP, in terms of our media relations office, we're always available to help you vet interviews, and also able to suggest other people for reporters to interview if it's something that you can't take on. Next slide, please. So we advise when you do get an interview request, it's almost always a good idea to pause before you do that interview. Schedule it at least a few minutes in the future. Tell the reporter you can call them back in half an hour or sometime later that day or that week, and take that time to really prepare. And when you think about it, if you were giving a presentation at a conference or to your colleagues, you would take time to prepare. You might make slides, you might write out some notes, spend a little bit of time to make sure you are communicating exactly what you want. And that's a very controlled situation where you know exactly who your audience is, you know how much time you'll have to give your message, and you have total control of how that message is presented. But the media interview is uncontrolled. You might talk to a reporter for 20 minutes and they will take 20 seconds or one sentence out to quote you on. So you want to be very careful that your message is very well defined and that you have all the message supports in place, and that you're able to deliver it effectively. So do a little background check on the reporter. If you vetted that outlet and reporter, or your media office or AAP did that on your behalf, then you'll have that information. But you want to know a little bit about how they've covered this issue in the past, if they have a particular angle, all of that information. Anticipate the questions that might come up. It's a good idea to Google the topic of that interview the same day as your interview, because you'll find out if there is a new study, if a celebrity's kid has come down with some illness that you might be asked about. Oh, there we are. The reporter is Googling, so you want to see what the reporter is seeing, so that you can be aware of what might come up. And so, for example, if you're doing an interview now about COVID vaccine, you need to be ready to answer questions about myocarditis. You need to be ready to answer questions about infertility, long-term side effects, school vaccine requirements. Even if you don't maybe have a specific answer about school vaccine requirements, you need to be ready to answer that question because it's probably going to come up. And then choose what your main message is. This is something you should be very deliberate about. What is the number one thing that you want to get across in that interview? If you get one quote, what is the content of that quote? And then you'll craft some supports that will help you deliver that message. Next slide, please. Okay, so we call that main message your single overriding communications objective. The number one thing that you want to get across in that interview. And so here's an example in this blue circle of one that we have been using. We now need to edit this to include younger children as well. But this is a message that you want to repeat throughout your interview. You can thread it through various answers. You can develop some supports in the form of a story or anecdote, some statistics, data, or research, some sound bites, and really create a personal message map for that interview that has really as many of these elements as you can. And that way, if the reporter asks you 5 or 6 questions, you have enough material to answer all of them. So one answer could really be your SACO, your main point. Maybe one of them you answer in the form of an anecdote or a patient story. Maybe a couple you answer with research or data. And then hopefully you have 1 or 2 really strong sound bites that you can sprinkle in. And that way, no matter what question and answer the reporter focuses on in terms of how to quote you, all of those pieces will carry your main message. Next slide, please. So stories and narrative, I can't emphasize enough how important these are. People really respond to narrative in a way that is unique. If you listen to a lecture for 20 minutes and in minute 15, the person shared a personal anecdote, it's quite likely a week later that anecdote might be the one thing that is still sticking in your mind. It helps cut through a lot of the clutter, a lot of the noise, and it helps people really care about an issue. So I would encourage you to think about some ways that you could include this in your personal talking points. It can be a patient story if you're careful to protect confidentiality. It can be a story about yourself as a parent or a family member, or even just a general human element about, as a pediatrician, I'm talking to families and here's what I'm hearing in my practice. Just some way to introduce a human element can really help. And reporters love this. If you tell a good anecdote, there's a really strong chance they will include that in your story. And so if you can develop this piece that really supports your key message, that can be incredibly effective. Next slide, please. So data research, it's great to have a few pieces of data at hand. You don't want to overload a reporter, but having 2 or 3 key data points that you can weave into your story, into your interview, really helps your credibility. It gives the reporter additional pieces that they can use to flesh out their story. You can follow up with actual research articles, especially if it's a print or online reporter. They appreciate having content to read. Also, I will tell you, in your role as a scientist and a pediatrician, as a physician, the more that you can do to translate this data, not only for the reporter, but for their readers or viewers, that's really, really helpful. Reporters often are not used to reading scientific research. It can be difficult for them to understand and then also to translate to their audience. So if you can do some of that work for them, that's really helpful. And statistics, we advise you use a technique called social math, which is a way of discussing data so it relates to people's everyday lives. So for example, we say, instead of talking about the millions of children who live in poverty, you would say 1 in 6 children live in poverty. Instead of using a really large number of children who die of SIDS in your state, you might say the number of infants who die of SIDS in our state would fill 5 school buses. Or the volumes, you can use the number of people who would fill a local stadium, or the size of a town that's in your state. Just those are ways that help numbers resonate with people in a way that is easier to grasp. Next slide, please. So here's an example of that. When AAP came out with some new guidelines around the content of sugar in sugary drinks, one of our spokespeople calculated that the amount of sugary drinks the average American consumes every year is 33 gallons, which is about the same that would fill a bathtub. So we had this graphic of a bathtub, and Good Morning America actually filled up 33 gallon containers with colored liquid and have them on set, just as a very visual representation of what that is. So yes, it's kind of gimmicky, but it really conveyed a message about the volume of sugary drinks that people are consuming. Next slide, please. So sound bites, these are really well-crafted, pithy, colorful language. You want to make something that is irresistible to the reporter to quote. Journalists like to sprinkle these through their story. It makes it entertaining and engaging, and really, gets the message across very, very quickly. It's something that usually you have to think about in advance. They're not written on the fly. The best way to start creating sound bites is just to listen to them. If you're paying attention to the news that you're watching on TV or listening on the radio, just start to hear what sound bites are included, and you'll start to get some ideas that way. Always answer in complete sentences. This is a good way just to help, especially if you're doing an audio, radio or TV interview. You want to, after they ask the question, pause and answer in a complete sentence so that it's easier for them to extract that and use it in their piece. Avoid repeating a negative statement, especially if the question is framed in a negative way. Take a moment and reframe it in a way that you would want to be quoted. One piece of advice, if you think the interview has ended and you're chit-chatting with the reporter, be aware they could still quote you in that moment. So you're always on the record, and be careful what you say on the margins of that interview, because in fact the reporter might still be considering that fair game to use. And metaphors, again, this is something to think about in advance, because some metaphors have hidden meanings or unintended baggage that can really color your message. Next slide, please. So here are some formulas to generate sound bites, and I'd be happy to provide a list of examples of these if that would helpful. But metaphors. So, for example, not vaccinating your child is like riding in the car without a seatbelt. You hope you don't have an accident, but you don't want to take that risk. Triples, the best family dinners have healthy food, warm conversation, and no digital media. Rhetorical questions, more than 15 million children live in poverty. How much longer can we ignore this public health crisis? Contrasts, go to the drugstore for gum and bandages, but trust your pediatrician to keep your child healthy. Definitiveness, we must solve this public health crisis now. Superlatives, poverty is the biggest threat to children's health that exists today. Emotions, as a pediatrician and a parent, I am heartbroken at our failure to protect the children of Flint and other communities from lead poisoning. Surprise twist, as a pediatrician, I routinely urge my patients' parents to help their children live healthier lives by filing their annual tax returns. And tweaked cliches, an apple a day may or may not keep the doctor away, but if you want to keep your children healthy, be sure to vaccinate them on schedule. So those are just some creative ideas, but really a strong, pithy, short statement that uses non-jargon and is very clear is effective. That helps reporters insert that into their story, and it helps you get your message out. All right, next slide, please. So it's an unfortunate rule of human existence that we look before we listen, and we make fast judgments based on what we see. So how you appear if you're doing an on-camera interview is important. It affects how people receive your message, how they perceive your credibility. So in terms of wardrobe, we advise solid colors are usually always a safe bet. A color is good. So a jewel tone like emerald green, navy blue, red, those are always usually flattering, as well as, or pastel colors are also good. Avoid all black or all white. If you are in your clinic or office or somewhere where a lab coat or a white coat is appropriate attire, that can be a nice way to really instantly confer your credibility and authority as a physician. So that's a nice choice if that's something that you often wear. Sometimes when we're doing videos at AAP, we have people wear a stethoscope around their neck as well. So those are all good choices. Minimal jewelry is usually good. You generally, you just don't want to distract from your message. If you are doing a Zoom or WebEx or Skype interview where you also have to set up your own set, then almost always you will want to add more lights to whatever your usual workspace is. It's good to have them either, in front of you or at a slight angle. You don't want them overhead or behind you, which creates weird shadows. If you're using your laptop camera, most likely you're going to need to prop your laptop up on some books. I didn't do that today for this presentation, so this angle is actually not the best. So I would, if I were doing a TV interview, I would probably prop it up like this. You really want that camera to be at your eye level or slightly above. It's much more flattering. Of course, you want your background to be as clutter-free and professional as possible. You can test your technology in advance. Some stations will do this for you if you're not sure if you have a strong enough Wi-Fi connection. That's always good. Oh, can you go back? There you go. And if any of you need help, AAP would be happy to give you some tips. We have some printed material, or could suggest if you're doing multiple interviews and want to invest in equipment, a relatively inexpensive webcam or light or microphone. In terms of posture, it's best if you lean forward about 10 degrees so that your body is entering the frame of the camera. You don't want to be leaning back in your chair. You don't want to swivel. Avoid nodding your head. When we're talking with people in our regular lives, often you nod as a way to signal you're engaged in a conversation and encouraging them to continue. In an interview, especially if you're on camera, that really does signal, it can signal agreement. So I would advise you to try to, you don't need to be stiff, but just to avoid nodding. All right, next slide, please. So how you say it also matters. It's not only what you say, but what is heard. And so you want to have a warm tone as if you're counseling a family, not like you're giving a lecture. If you are a very fast talker, you will be served by trying to slow down a little bit. This includes whether you're talking to a print or online reporter, or if you're talking to a TV or radio reporter. People understand your message in the pause. So it's okay to pause in the middle of a statement, give the reporter time to catch up on their notes, or give your audience time to absorb your message before you move on. Most of the time, you really want to answer each question in a few sentences. If you're on minute 2 of your answer, there's a really strong chance you have rambled off of your main message. So give relatively short answers to help you stay with your talking points. Sometimes print reporters, you will have a longer interview time. So you might talk to someone for 20 or 30 minutes. And you can really go down a lot of different rabbit holes in that amount of time. And it's okay to answer the reporter's questions if you want to help educate them or give them additional background so that they fully understand the issue. You want their story to be accurate. If you find that you're going further off of your main messages because the reporter is asking more detailed questions about one area, it helps to sort of bring them back, maybe add a flag and say, well, yeah, I'm glad you understand that better. I just really want to point out, though, that the most important thing is X, Y, and Z, or the number one thing that your reader should know is this, just so that they have a little star in their notebook around what you thought was the most important things. It's okay to repeat your message multiple times. People have short attention spans. If you're doing a taped TV interview, often they will ask you the same question multiple times. And it can be hard to resist giving them a different answer because you're like, I already answered that. Maybe they want something else. I'll give them this. But you don't have to do that. Just if you have a strong message that is the answer to that question, just give the same answer. You can phrase it slightly different ways if they need a different format so that they can plug it into their script later, but you don't have to go off your message. And finally, avoid jargon. Just remember your end audience is the reader, the viewer out there. They're not likely to be physicians. And so you want to use language that is accessible. All right, next slide, please. So if you're in a situation, you're getting tough questions, analogies can be a helpful way to help people understand an issue. One that we're using now quite a lot around the COVID vaccine is that it works like a coach or a teacher for your immune system. The vaccine or a set of instructions for your immune system. And then the vaccine actually just teaches your immune system to build up and become stronger. So then it's your immune system that is able to protect your body against COVID. So that's an analogy that you could use. Going micro or macro is a good technique. If somebody is coming to you with a question that is an overgeneralization or a stereotype, you can go micro, maybe tell a story about an individual patient or family who is experiencing this issue in your practice, and really seeing it through the lens of a single individual can help create some better understanding on that topic. Or you can expand to a larger population. So a classic example is if somebody's saying, well, what about, you know, this child in this state who had this disease? What do you think happened there? You would say, well, you know, that is not my patient, so I can't comment on that case. But in general, what I could say is X, Y, and Z. Dangle is a technique I'll explore in a minute, and then acknowledge, bridge, contribute. This is bridging, which is a good skill to learn. I think I go into that on the next slide. So bridging or pivoting, this is a way to transition into your key message if the question that comes to you is either maybe it's a negative frame, or it's slightly off topic, or it's just a bad premise. And the formula that you use is acknowledge, bridge, contribute. This is a technique that you quite likely will need to use maybe once in an interview. You don't want to use it to answer every single question, or you start to sound like you're being evasive. We've all seen politicians do this too much, but it can be effective, and if done well, it can be very, very natural. Next slide, please. So here's some bridge lines that you can use. There's likely to be one or two on here that are phrases that you might already use. What's most important for parents to understand is this, or, well, let me tell you what we've really been seeing. I'm not sure that's the case. In fact, what I really are seeing in my practice is this. I wouldn't say that. What I would say is this. Next slide. Here's how this looks in practice. So a question that we had a few years ago was around the measles outbreak, that do we blame anti-vax parents for the measles outbreak? And number one, we don't blame parents, and we don't like to use the term anti-vax or label people that way. So we wanted to avoid that sort of negative frame and also avoid blaming parents. So here's how we would answer that. I blame the measles virus. It's incredibly contagious. This first two sentences acknowledge the topic of the question, which is who is to blame. What's most important, this phrase in red, is the bridge phrase. And then you'll see most of the answer is the contribution, is our key message. So we really briefly acknowledge the question, the topic of the question, bridge, and then most of the answer is our key message. And so you could say, you know, we don't repeat the negative frame of the question. We don't use the word anti-vax, but we still have clearly addressed the question in a way that communicates our priority message. Next question. Next slide, please. Okay, so baiting the hook, this is the dangling or the baiting method technique, which is a little bit more advanced. You really need to have a well-developed message map and a high comfort level with media interviews, but this can be a really effective way to help guide the interview in a way that you want it to go. It involves ending your answer to a question in a way that prompts the follow-up question that will help you give another of your messages. So you would end your first answer with one of these phrases, but that's not really the biggest problem I'm seeing now. Or if you're talking about maybe some research, what we found out was actually really surprising. Besides that, what I'm really worried about is this. And then you stop talking. It's a cliffhanger. You have to let the reporter follow up and ask the obvious question. Well, what is the biggest problem? Or, well, what did you find out? Oh, tell me more. What are you worried about? If they don't do that, that's okay. Just be flexible and move on. And hopefully there's a way you can make your point later in the interview. But this does allow the reporter to play the role that they're supposed to play, which is to ask you questions, while also still giving you a little bit of a way to control the thread of that interview. Next question. So the other thing that I advise you to have on your message map is really what your call to action is. What do you want people to do? They want to change their behavior. Do you want to advocate for a policy change? Look online for information. Really one talking point that we use really in all of our interviews are around COVID is, we recommend parents, if they have any questions about the vaccine, to reach out to their pediatrician. Pediatricians want to talk with you. So schedule that visit, or look at healthychildren.org for more information. This is a nice soundbite. Often reporters will use this information at the end of their story because it wraps it all up in a nice bow. So have this in mind as part of your preparation. Next slide. And here, we're available. Lisa is talking to reporters all day. And I'm available as well. So really know that we are a resource. We have talking points right now on COVID vaccine. We're updating these pretty much every day. So if you have an interview coming up and you want to know what's the latest, we can send those to you. We also help facilitate op-eds and letters. We do have a blog on AAP, aap.org. We're always looking for content for that. So if any of that is of interest to you, please don't hesitate to reach out. I think that concludes my presentation. So I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Mead.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. I want to make sure we leave time for questions and discussion, but I'm just going to go through a little bit of sort of what this looks like in practice in real life. And please feel free to chat in questions as well. So this is a little bit of I like to use this graph. It might have changed in the last couple of years or the last, however many months since COVID started, but you can see that traditionally doctor is way over on the kind of upswing of competence and warmth. And I think that ultimately we are a very trusted profession. I think that COVID has eroded a little bit of that, and just kind of current climate has eroded a little bit of that, but pediatricians are certainly one of the most trusted, I think, when we think about our relationships with our patients and our communities. And so it's just important for us to remember that we have a voice that sort of needs to be out there. I think it's really important for us to be people that are speaking out about truthful information. And I think we're really well qualified, specifically well qualified within medicine, to do that in a way that is warm and supportive and non-confrontational, and also truthful and evidence-based. Next slide, Jennifer. You all know this. These are just some examples of things that patients will find online if they're looking for information. Unfortunately, lots of non-truthful information, and I think we're all used to hearing questions about this type of thing from our patients. And just another reason why it's important for us to also be voices that are present, because otherwise it's very easy for this to be sort of the only truth that people are finding. So in terms of prep for interview, I think, Susan went over some of this, and I think there are some additional questions that you can ask. Often when people start doing media, I think they feel like they can't ask questions or they can't ask for certain things. It's not demanding. They're totally used to this, and it is absolutely fine to make sure that you know as much information as you need to know to be comfortable with the interview. For things that are really not tricky topics at all, it's pretty easy, but a lot of the topics that we're getting questions about now are very nuanced, and I think it's really helpful to just sort of know as much as you can. If WCAP is helping coordinate the interview for you, Jennifer and I know most of the people that are kind of in the media in this area, and I think between the two of us have a pretty good sense of kind of what their angle is. And I will say the vast majority of at least TV interviews locally are very friendly. They just want content and they really want an expert voice. In my experience in Seattle, print, like Seattle Times, tends to be a little bit different, and then some of the national outlets may be different as well, but you will know the topic ahead of time, right? So you can always ask for the angle, and this has been mentioned before this morning, but you can say sort of, what information are you most interested in hearing? What's your angle? Are you interviewing other people for this story? And so just as Susan mentioned before, if it's a story about vaccines and they're interviewing someone who's completely opposed or someone whose child had some type of reaction to a vaccine, that's just important for you to know in terms of kind of how you craft your message. Again, which journalist is it is helpful, and the vast majority of them, again, are pretty friendly. And then, is it just you? Is it a panel? If it's a live interview, again, who are they interviewing? Otherwise, if it's taped, is this live or taped? And I'll talk a little bit about how that kind of differs when it comes to our strategy. And then how long do they expect the segment to be? Those are all totally appropriate questions to ask. And I think helpful to know, especially if it is a tricky topic, because if this is going to be a 2-minute segment, it's really ultimately important to get your message out very quickly in the interview, especially if it's live. If it's a 5-minute segment or it's a taped interview and you have time to do that, then you can relax a little bit about kind of making sure that you hit hard with your SOCO. It is also totally fine to ask for the questions in advance. So if you're new to media or the topic is tricky, at least usually by the morning of or the day before, they will have a script. And so it is fine to ask for the questions ahead of time. I think it can be really helpful. You don't want to practice your answers to the point where it sounds like they're rehearsed in the interview, but I think it will give you a good sense of what they're going for. And it's fine to veto questions. So if you get the questions ahead of time and you say, I don't really think this is a question that I can answer appropriately or adequately in this interview, or I don't think this is what's really important, I think what we should focus on is this. That is absolutely fine. And they're typically very responsive to that. They don't know what they're doing, to be totally honest. They don't know the details of sort of the medical information and what they should be asking necessarily. They're often Googling to just figure out what questions to ask or basing it on other interviews they've seen. And so they really welcome that expert voice. So if you say, I think there's actually a question missing here, what's really important for people to know is this, they will almost always add that in. They actually really want to know that information. And then again, think about a couple of sound bites. It doesn't have to be 10 different things, but just a couple of things you want to make sure that you get across. And then if you have a call to action, that's great as well. I think relating it to personal stories or decisions has become super important. And a lot of the media that I've done in the last year or so, they're very interested in not just your advice as a pediatrician about how you make decisions about the vaccine or travel or whatever it is, but how you're making those decisions for your own family. And I think if you can relate your information to the fact that you are also struggling with the weight of these things and that your advice is the same advice that you give to yourself, then I think that's really helpful. And then authoritarianism versus supportive messaging. I think what people really don't want to hear, especially in the kind of COVID climate, is you should do this because I say so. I think what people want to hear is, these are really tough decisions. These are hard decisions for everybody to make. Here's why I think this is the right decision. And this is the right decision that I made for my family, et cetera. And then I think if all else fails, if you can tell the interview is winding down, or even if the interviewer says, okay, I think that's it, oftentimes they'll ask you at the end, is there anything else you want to add? But even if they don't, just what one thing do you want to leave them with? And that might be a soundbite, it might be a piece of data, it might be something that you just want to make sure you get across, but you can almost always kind of sneak that in at the end, even if it's a live interview. And then just a brief note on setup. So Susan talked a little bit about appearance, kind of what to wear, et cetera. I think for us and for many of us who are doing this in our workplace settings during the day, it's really important to think about what our location is. So what is the background? How much noise is there? Making absolutely certain there's no patient info and no personal info that you wouldn't want to be on television that's visible in the background. Lighting is important. And I agree with Susan, like this is not, I mean, it's fine, but I don't typically do interviews with overhead light just because it's can give some weird shadows. This is a picture of my setup. You don't need all of this stuff, but if you're doing a lot of media and you're interested in recommendations on mics and that kind of thing, I'm happy to give those. But I think that having lighting that is lighting towards your face is really important. That can be a window, that can be a ring light like this. That can be a light that you clip onto your computer. Beth's asking what light I recommend. I'll put the one I have in the chat after this. I've been really happy with it. And the nice thing you can see here, it's really flexible. So if I'm doing a standing interview, it's a tripod that can go all the way to the floor, or it can be at my desk. I can put my phone in it if I'm kind of on the fly and I don't have a laptop. But I've been happy with it and it's held up really well. And it's not expensive. I think it was like $40 or something. And then I have a mic, but you really don't need one unless you're doing a ton of media. But earbuds can be helpful, especially if there's background noise. So if you're doing it on a laptop or a phone, having earbuds that do some background noise filtration can actually be very helpful for the reporters. So I think that's something to think about. And then you just want to make sure you give yourself at least a few minutes for kind of a tech check, mostly so that you don't feel stressed. They can vamp and they can sort of delay a couple minutes if they need to, but you don't want to go into an interview being really flustered about what the tech setup is. So then day of, this is kind of different depending on whether it's taped or live. Most things probably will be taped that you'll get requests for from WCAAP or through WCAAP. But as you develop relationships with reporters, you may get a lot more requests for live segments, and it's much easier to do them now that it's virtual. To go in studio before, I think, was a rate limiting step for a lot of people, especially people who were working full time, because it's hard to make it down there during a day of practice, right? But now that it's so easy to do virtual segments live, I think there's a lot more opportunity actually for most of us to fit those in. If it's in person, you want to make sure that you're there a little bit early, but make sure you buffer some time on the back end, especially if it's live, because they will often run late and you'll not be done at the time that they told you that you would be done. Again, you can ask for questions or even the script. They typically have it written ahead of time. If you're live or if you're waiting to go on virtually, you can always ask to clarify whether your mic is hot immediately, because essentially we should just assume everything is on the record unless it's explicitly said otherwise. And so you don't want to be backstage waiting to go to an interview talking about how, the public are idiots for not vaccinating or whatever. That's information that you don't want to be said on a hot mic for sure. You can always ask for water if you need it. If you're in person, make sure you're looking at the host, not the camera. And if it's virtual, you want to look directly at sort of your device camera so that it looks like you're looking at the host when you're talking to them. And then again, just speak the way that we talk to patients. This is something we are so practiced in, and I think we kind of get nervous and forget that sometimes when we're doing interviews. But the way that we talk to families, we engage them, we smile, we are conversational, we don't use jargon. All of those things are really critical to kind of giving a good interview as well. And it's something that you all know how to do very, very, very well. If they ask you a question and you don't know the answer, it is fine to say that. If it's a print interview, you can say that you'll get back to them with the right information. And if it's TV or if it's something that's more live, you can say that you don't have that information at the ready, but you'll follow up on social media or their website and they can post the correct information for people. And then finally, again, if they're not getting to something that you think is really important, just bring it up. So, they're asking you the questions, but this is really a conversation between two people. So if you just feel like, gosh, they're missing the most important point here, you can work into your answer or at the end of your answer and say, one thing that I think is really important for people to know is blah, 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 and then just bring up what you want to bring up. Challenging questions. So Susan went over a lot of bridging techniques. I think take a pause, take a breath, just respond positively and factually, or you can use all of these bridging techniques. It's really important not to get into a negative tone of conversation or seem like you're getting upset or angry because of a question. And so I use a lot of what I think is most important is this, or what I think we're really talking about is this. Or sometimes I just say, I just don't even answer the question if I don't think it's a valid question. And I say, well, here's what I do know. And I talk about the things that I want to get across. We want to use facts and we want to keep it positive. And I think those things are really important in not seeming defensive when you're being interviewed, which really ultimately kind of undermines credibility. We want to relate to public and relate to parents. And again, sometimes using our own experience is really, really helpful, or stories of patients if you have permission to share those. And then again, you really are in more control than you think, and you certainly control the end of the interview. So I think leaving with something that is important, that is positive, that kind of ends things on the note you want to end on, especially for live interviews, is really, really helpful when it comes to getting messages across. And then often there's a lot of questions like, how do I actually do this? I mean, practice is busy. I'm a hospitalist, so probably it's a little more flexible for me than for many people schedule-wise. But if it's a live segment, you can ask for a specific time. So if they contact Jennifer and they say, can we have somebody to talk at 8:40 in the morning on Q13? If you can't do that time, you can say, I can't make that, but I can do 8 o'clock or I can do 8:10. And they're really flexible often with schedules. Taping is usually more flexible, but usually it's a same day request and they usually want it before early afternoon. So if you take 6 hours to get back to a reporter, typically they've moved on to somebody else already. This really is fast. So especially for things that are TV interviews, it might just take 5 or 10 minutes. They're really quick. So if you can fit it in between patients at lunch, it's not going to be an hour-long process. They're speedy. And I think that helps us kind of fit things in, but you know your schedule best. And so if you have certain time points where you're typically available, you can also let Jennifer know that ahead of time so that when she's reaching out to people, she knows, oh, Amy can never do Fridays, or 9 o'clock is always good for this person. And let us know what the best way is to contact you with opportunities. So if you never check your email during the day and you want to be texted, let us know that. And then, Jennifer will reach out to see if you want to be on the contact list, but we're happy to kind of work that around. If you never want to be texted and you only want to be emailed, that's fine. I think email gets tricky for people for those kind of last minute requests. And so often people want to be texted, and then we can always help prep as well. So with talking points or just kind of general coaching, we're happy to do prep work ahead of time. If you're really interested in doing a lot of this, I think having a setup kind of ready to go in your office the way that I have it is super helpful, just because if something last minute comes up, you've kind of got your light, you've got your laptop stand, and you can just make it happen instead of scrambling to try to find a place to do it that's quiet or that has the right lighting or whatever. And then when major news is expected, so with COVID, we often have a heads up. Okay, the FDA is meeting on this day about vaccine for kids, for example. And so if things are expected that are coming up, you can think ahead of time about talking points and messages, and we can also help with that. But just expect that there will be certain time points at which we will have a ton of requests. And so if you're interested and available, you can always let Jennifer know ahead of time too, like, hey, I'm around this week. I know that we're going to be hearing about vaccines for 5 to 11. Feel free to reach out. And then I just was asked briefly to touch on the power of social media. This is something that some people are interested in and some people are not, and that's totally fine. I think that it can be a really helpful way to amplify messages and to connect with people. So you can actually build some nice relationships with reporters or stations this way. It helps to follow kind of legislators, community advocates, other physicians who are really active in that space, professional societies, and then local news media contacts. And then you want to have kind of regular touch points with specific people. So I think that that can be over email or it can be in social media, but often social media is a great way to make those initial connections. And then you really want to think about kind of advancing shared missions. So mentioning or tagging AAP or WCAAP or other organizations or reporters that are sort of in line with the missions that we want to achieve. And definitely share out appearances that you do. So if you do an interview with somebody, retweet that when they tweet it or when WCAP tweets it. Make sure that you're amplifying that message. And the more that you kind of build that connection, you tag the station, you tag the reporter, the more they'll think of you when they have an opportunity. And so if you're sort of just on their radar in that way, it makes it very easy for them to consider you as a source when they have a piece that they want to do. And it also makes it easy for them to reach you. So you may just get a tweet, for example, that says, hey, are you available on this topic? And if you do, it's great if you can kind of run it through Jennifer to make sure that we're aware and also that we're not working multiple angles, but it's nice for them to be able to kind of have a direct connection to you as well. So main takeaways, I think ultimately, just remember that you are an expert, you have an expert voice. You're an expert in child health and public health and vaccines and all of these things that we're talking about. There should be no imposter syndrome. This is the same expert voice that you use with families every day in your practice, and this is just doing it on a different scale. And no interview is going to be perfect. So no matter how much of this you do, you're always going to say at the end, oh gosh, I wish I had mentioned this, or it sounded kind of funny when I said that. If it's a taped interview, you can always say, I don't like the way I answered that question, or I don't think it made sense. Can we redo it? They're happy to do that. And it's totally fine to ask that. If you say something in a taped interview that's not live and you think, well, that does not sound the way I wanted it to, ask them to redo it. They're usually very happy to do that. And then I think just focusing again on 1 or 2 main messages that you really want to make sure you leave people with. Just a note, if you do this a lot, you will definitely be antagonized, unfortunately. And I think it's just helpful to know that ahead of time and to have strategies. And most of the strategy is just ignore it. To be honest, I don't think it's helpful to engage, and I don't think it's helpful to take it personally. But I think when people are not used to having that, sometimes when they start doing this work, that can be something that deters them or just is unexpected. But there's a lot of vitriol online, unfortunately, and some of it will come your way if you're really in the public space talking, and you just kind of have to be willing to leave it alone, ignore it, and sort of move on.
I want to go to school today because we're
Next
doing
slide. I think that's kind of all I had, but yeah, that's it. So just want to leave a few minutes for questions, comments. And Beth, I'll put the link to the light I have in the chat as well.
So much, Elizabeth and Susan and Lisa. I just have a few upcoming events here. We've got a lot going on in November and December, so hopefully I'll be able to make it to that. And I'll just reiterate that the chapter's here to help. So, you know, don't feel like you're going it alone. If you get any media requests, you know, we're always here to support you. And with that, we have a couple minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions for these folks or examples.
Beth has her hand up.
Oh.
Oh, hi. Yeah, thanks. I'm doing none of your things right now. Advice. So my question is, like, you know, we've seen such inequality in how all of this vaccine is rolling out, and we're going to see it all over again with the 5 to 11-year-olds. And I just think we all could really use some advice or help in reaching out to different media sources. I know our hospital is willing to do it, but it's not like their go-to thing. And I just would appreciate, you know, advice both from the AP and anyone else on how we could do a better job with the Spanish media, smaller media groups that are reaching out to families, you know, that aren't reading the Seattle Times. Thanks.
I don't know if Susan or Lisa wants to answer that, but I'll just say I do have a list of media in our state, and we've done some outreach to Spanish-speaking radio stations and had some good success with that. And we recently had a pediatrician on Rainier Avenue Radio recently. So a lot of times it's just a matter of giving it a shot and you know, approaching them with a story. I think often media are grateful, you know, that you're coming to them. It makes their job easier. And, you know, I don't have a ton of time to be doing, you know, just cold calling, but definitely we have the capacity to be targeting different communities around the state and making sure that our message is getting to people in the right places at the right time.
Absolutely. And I think if anyone who's on the training this morning is a pediatrician or knows a pediatrician who's from certain communities, whether that's geographic communities or cultural communities, who wants to do this, please let us know, because we are very happy to connect people with opportunities and to provide coaching and training if they want it. And I think that sometimes we just don't know who might be interested.
Yeah, I would love that. And I will send a follow-up email to everybody just asking, you know, gauging your interest. So, and if you know anyone who isn't on this training, we're recording it and I can share it. But yeah, I think it's really important for us as a chapter to have a variety of voices out there. And so that people are seeing the real us in the community.
And if you have an idea for a story, like if you have a pitch, if you are seeing something new practice that you think is important to talk about, also please let us know that, because we're very helpful to make connections with media, happy to make connections with media. And so if you're seeing something that you think should be being talked about, but they want content. And I think that's the other thing that is, I had this idea before I started doing a lot of media that it would be difficult to pitch things or to sort of get the content that you wanted out there. But when you think about the number of hours every day of content that these stations have to come up with, they are desperate for content ideas. And so if you have something that is that resonates with them, they'll jump at the chance to do something.
Yeah, that's very true. Okay, great. Any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, well, with that, I'll give you a few minutes of your day back, and thank you so much for being with us. And I hope we'll see you on these upcoming webinars that we've got going in the next couple of weeks. But thank you all and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Susan and Lisa, for being here, and Jennifer for
Yes.
coordinating.
Thank you so much. We're grateful.
Thanks, everyone.